got the Best Free Paper Award in DOS in 2006. He got the gold medal for Best Paper and Video in Rajasthan of Thalmic Society. He has been in more than 150 conferences as speaker, faculty, tutor, chief instructor, co-instructor, and judge. Right now, he is presently the treasurer of the Strabismus and Pediatric Ophthalmology Society of India. He is also the executive member of the Glaucoma Society of India, Indian Neuro-Ophthalmological Society, and the Rajasthan Ophthalmological Society. He was the organizing secretary of the very well organized Glucopedia in 2017 at Jaipur for the annual conference of Glaucoma Society of India. It's an absolute honor and such a pleasure to welcome Dr. Ankur Sinha, and we are so grateful to him for giving us his valuable time. I'd like Dr. Manish Singh to take over now, please.
I can hear now.
Thank you, sir. Again, welcome Dr. Ankur and Dr. Manavdeep Singh, sir. I think Dr. Manavdeep Singh, sir, will be joining us very soon. So the first presentation is by Dr. Ankur Sinha. Without wasting any further time, I request Dr. Ankur to please go ahead with this presentation. A small announcement for all the participants. What are the doubts we have? Please type it in the chat box. We'll try to take all the questions. And you can share your screen also.
Hello, Dr. Ankur, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Now we can hear you, sir.
Okay, thank you so much.
So, beautiful. You can hear us now? Dr. Manav, sir, you can hear us?
Yes, sure.
We lost Manish. Dr. Manish, we cannot hear you now.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay. We can start.
Yeah, we can start now. You can share your screen.
Okay.
We can start the presentation.
Okay. So, thank you, Dr. Satyajit and Dr. Manish and Dr. Pooja to give us the opportunity to interact with you guys. And I'll be talking briefly about the commonly used drugs in glaucoma. The presentation would be more theoretical, but it is very important because a lot of things, they come into your exam as a question paper. And I have tried to compile them in a form of a presentation, but it doesn't contain each and everything. But I think this is the bare minimum which is required from you guys when you appear in the exam. So I'll start. So first of all, before we start about the commonly used drugs, we should know the aqueous humor dynamics, that how it is produced and how it goes out of the eye. Because then we can understand how each and every drug will act. So the major structures related to the aqueous humor dynamics are the ciliary processes, the trabecular meshwork, and the uveoscleral pathway. The aqueous is produced by the park plicata of the ciliary body. And the production basically consists of three processes. The diffusion. The diffusion is a process where the constituents or the solutes are transported from one area to another area through a membrane, and they travel across the concentration gradient. The second part which constitutes the aqueous is ultrafiltration. So ultrafiltration, we have water and the water-soluble substances. They pass through the small pores or the fenestrations in the ciliary epithelia, and they transfer from the ciliary epithelium towards the posterior chamber in the form of aqueous. And the third and the most important part is the aqueous secretion, which is the major component of aqueous humor production in the eye. It comes from pigmented and non-pigmented epithelial cells both. Now, active secretion is an important part, and it involves selective transcellular movements of anions and cations and the molecules, and they go across the concentration gradient. So like if the concentration is more even in the aqueous, still they travel from the blood to the aqueous. So they travel against the concentration gradient. They are mediated by protein receptors in which are called as aquaporins, and these aquaporins are powered by ATPase, and we all know ATPase is the seat of energy for all the processes which take place in the cells. Another two important factors which provide this energy is the sodium-potassium ATPase and the carbonic anhydrase. And this carbonic anhydrase is responsible for hydration of carbon dioxide and production of bicarbonate ions. And these bicarbonate ions then pull a lot of ions from the blood into the aqueous. So they kind of shift the pH of the aqueous towards the negative side, and then this is how the aqueous secretion starts. Now, this is the diagrammatic representation. Now, on the left side, we have the ciliary body stroma, and the right side, we have posterior chamber. And there's a transfer of ions through the transcellular route through the ion channels, which can be symports and the antiports. And in the end, what happens is the net charge into the posterior chamber is negative, and towards the stroma is little positive. So overall, there is secretion of ions along with some resorption in the opposite direction. Now, the lower part talks about the energy dependent or cyclic AMP dependent pathway, and along with the enzymes and parenchyma mediators, these aquaporins in the ion channels, they kind of transfer everything from the blood to the aqueous against the concentration gradient. Now, outflow. Outflow has two parts, the conventional pathway. We all know the conventional pathway follows the trabeculum meshwork, the inner wall of Schlem's canal, into its lumen, into the draining collector channels, aqueous veins, and then the episcleral veins, which is an IOP-dependent pathway. And then we have this non-conventional route, which follows the uveal meshwork, the anterior face of the ciliary body, and the aqueous humor enters through the connective tissue between these muscle bundles, and through the suprachoroidal space, it goes out through the sclera, and this process is IOP-independent. Now, this is the aqueous outflow pathway. We have talked about the conventional pathway. The conventional pathway, we have the trabecular meshwork and the Schlem's canal. The Schlem's canal consists, or trabecular meshwork consists of three parts: the uveal meshwork, the corneoscleral meshwork, and the juxtacanalicular tissue. Now, what happens among these three parts is that the uveal and the corneoscleral meshwork is porous and does not provide any resistance to the outflow of the aqueous. Juxtacanalicular tissue is composed of cells embedded in the extracellular matrix, and this is the seat of maximum resistance, which is there for the aqueous outflow pathway resistance kind of thing in the aqueous outflow. And this is what is diseased in the open angle glaucoma, and this is how the pressure rises. Now, in the medical management, we have mainstay of treatment as drugs. In the open angle glaucoma, this is the reduction of IOP is the mainstay of treatment. However, in the angle closure, we can have laser iridotomy or trabeculoplasty, which can be done. And then if the IOP is still high, we can continue to use these anti-glaucoma medications. Now, these are the various drugs classified on the type of the drugs, on the basis of the type of the drugs. Like we have drugs acting on the autonomic agents, autonomic nervous system, cholinergic, and the adrenergic system. Then we have got cholinergic system. We have pilocarpine, carbachol, and ecothiopate. The drugs acting on the adrenergic system can further be divided into beta blockers and the alpha agonists. The beta blockers commonly used are timolol, betaxolol, while in the alpha agonist, the commonly used drug is brimonidine. Then we have prostaglandins and prostaglandin analogs, in which we have latanoprost, bimetoprost, and travoprost. Carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, we have acetazolamide, dorzolamide, brinzolamide. Rho-kinase inhibitors are a relatively new entrant into the Indian market, but we have ripasudil and etazudil, which are worldwide known. And then the hyperosmotic agents in the form of mannitol and glycerol. So this is a table which you should remember. And whenever there's a question like this, you have to classify these drugs based upon their pharmacologic profile. And then we have to discuss each and every drug, how they work, and what are the problems of each and every drug. Now, cholinergic agonists. The commonly used drug amongst this class is pilocarpine. The mechanism of action is these drugs are directly acting muscarinic agents. That is, they directly act on the acetylcholine receptors and promote the muscarinic pathway. So what they cause is they cause increased accommodation, posterior depression of lens. This kind of pulls the root of iris and alters the configuration of trabecular meshwork and Schlem's canal, that thereby increasing the aqueous outflow facility. So along with this increased accommodation, posterior lens depression and all, this causes meiosis also. So there is the minor mechanism of action. They also can cause some amount of decrease in the aqueous production. And it is very important to understand that they significantly decrease the uveoscleral pathway because they tighten the ciliary muscles and does not allow the aqueous to flow through these ciliary body muscles. So in angle closure glaucoma, they kind of relieve the pupillary block because of meiosis and change the configuration of peripheral iris. That is why they are very commonly used in angle closure glaucoma. Now they are available as topical drops, even in the standalone formulations or in fixed dose combinations along with beta blockers. Gels and other delivery systems are also available, but they are not much in use. The dosage is 3 times a day alone, but when they are mixed with beta blockers, they are usually given twice a day. Now, less commonly used drugs are ecothiopate, which is acting indirectly by inhibiting the acetylcholinesterase, thereby increasing the cholinergic activity. Carbachol is direct and indirectly acting both, and it is usually used in intraoperative procedures to cause meiosis intraoperatively. Now, there can be many adverse reactions like systemic features, systemic adverse reactions like fever, diarrhea, flushing, increased urination, etc. There is a significant ciliary spasm, meiosis, and myopic shift. All these are very common in young adults and they can cause significant visual disturbances. Even in the elderly, when they have a small central cataract, this miosis can cause disabling visual disturbances in these patients. They are also known to be cataractogenic and they predispose the patients to retinal detachments and breaks. They also increase the blood aqueous permeability, thereby they are slightly pro-inflammatory in nature, and there can be a risk of hypersensitivity and cicatricial pemphigoid with the use of these drugs. Now, clinical tips about this drug is it is a very useful adjunct drug. It is very commonly used in angle closure patients, especially for those who are waiting for peripheral iridotomy or to break the acute angle attack. They are not to be used in patients with uveitis, rubiosis, because they break the blood aqueous barrier and they are known to be slight pro-inflammatory. They should not be used in patients with developmental glaucoma and extensive synovial closure because they tend to reduce these uveous scleral outflow and compromise the whatever outflow was there from the non-conventional pathway, but the conventional pathway is already occluded because of the non-formation of angles or because of the extensive synovial closure. They are very important because they sometimes be used in open angle glaucoma and ocular hypertension to buy some time when the patient is waiting for a surgery. And do not forget to dilate the patients intermittently when we are giving these drugs so that we don't have a fixed rigid pupil in a long-term usage of these drugs. Now, next class of drugs are beta blockers. They are again commonly used drugs. The most commonly used drug here is timolol, and the second most commonly used is betaxolol. Mechanism of action is they decrease the aqueous production. They have direct action on the ciliary processes. They decrease the ciliary perfusion and decrease the ultrafiltration. It does not affect the outflow facility or the blood aqueous barrier. There have been reports of reduced perfusion in the retina, choroidal, and the ciliary body, including the optic nerve head, and they do not tend to control the nocturnal IOP. So the IOP can have a rise in the nighttime when we are trying to use these drugs for these patients. Now, these are the various types of beta blockers in their dosage and the selective action on beta and beta 2 blockers. So timolol is a non-selective beta 1 beta 2 blocker. So is metoprolol and levobunolol. Then we have got betaxolol, which is cardioselective or beta 1 blocker. So this causes less propensity to exacerbate or produce asthma in patients who are predisposed to it. And cartilol has some amount of intrinsic sympathomimetic activity here in the fourth number here. And this can cause some amount of reduction of cholesterol abnormalities in the patients who are predisposed to have dyslipidemia. Now, the most widely used drug in this class is timolol, available as topical formulations alone or in fixed drug combinations. They are also available as gel forming solutions, and they tend to reduce the dosage to once daily when you're using in GFS. Dosage is twice daily alone or in combination, but when they are combined with prostaglandins, the dosage is once daily. Now, adverse reactions. So you can have many adverse reactions with beta blockers. The topical ones, they cause the local adverse reactions in the form of tear film dysfunction, burning conjunctival epidemia, epithelial erosions, cicatricial pemphigoid, and granulomatous anterior uveitis by the use of metoprolol, which is a common MCQ you can have in your exams. And then you can have systemic adverse reactions, which can range from all the kind of adverse reactions these beta blocker can cause. Cardiovascular could be bradycardia, arrhythmia, decreased myocardial function, syncope, postural hypotension. Then you can have exacerbation of asthma and bronchial reactivity. You can have depression, anxiety, confusion, hallucinations, fatigue, drowsiness. Cholesterol levels can go haywire. You can have decreased HDL, increased LDL and VLDL causing dyslipidemia. And you can even have GI disturbances, impotence, and dermatological disorders. So whenever we use these drugs, some things are to be very important to be known to us. They are one of the most commonly drugs used in the glaucoma. They are commonly seen to have systemic adverse reactions. The common ones are the asthma and depression. They are very useful in combination. They are cost effective. And we should be diluting these drugs to 0.25% because the commonest available formulation is 0.5%. When you're using with children and in pediatric glaucoma, we should try and dilute these drugs to 0.25%. Now, adrenergic stimulators. Adrenergic stimulators could be epinephrine or dipivefrin, placlonidine and brimonidine. Now, we'll talk about them one by one. So, dipivefrin is a prodrug of epinephrine and it converts into active drug after hydrolysis in cornea. Now, it is a directly acting sympathomimetic acting on both alpha as well as beta agonists. The mechanism here is vasoconstriction. Again, this vasoconstriction causes decreased ultrafiltration and they also tend to increase some amount of aqueous outflow facility. They are available as 0.1% solution twice daily. Adverse reactions could be burning, reactive hyperemia, pigmentation because there is adrenochrome, and you can have the pigmentation on the feet because of adrenals. So this is the same hormone, which is adrenaline, which is causing this pigmentation. Tearing, photophobia, which could be because of dilatation of the pupil, blurred vision, epidermalization of lacrimal punctum, and then you can have these mydriasis. Maculopathy can be there with the use of adrenaline, endothelial damage, and ocular hypoxia because of vasoconstriction. Apraclonidine is an alpha agonist. It's a para-amino derivative of clonidine, and clonidine is a commonly used antihypertensive drug by the physicians. It is a centrally acting drug. The clonidine is central acting, but apraclonidine doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, and it causes decreased aqueous protection and increase in the aqueous outflow facility. It is used in 1% for short-term IOP control and 0.5% for long-term therapy. Now, adverse reactions could be dry nose, dry mouth, follicular conjunctivitis with or without contact dermatitis, eyelid retraction, mydriasis, and conjunctival blanching because of vasoconstriction. Now, brimonidine is the commonly used drug in this class. It is selective alpha-2 agonist. Mechanism of action here is suppression of aqueous humor production and increase in the uveal scleral outflow. It is used in 0.2 and 0.1% as low strength, and when used alone, it is used for thrice daily, but in combination, you can use it twice daily. Adverse reactions, you can have ocular allergy, which includes conjunctival follicles, lid edema, severe periocular swelling and allergy, oral dryness, sedation and drowsiness is very common, and this causes profound CNS depression when it crosses the blood-brain barrier. Now, clinical tips here, it is a very common adjunct. It is a good adjunct drug. Allergic reactions are very, very common, and even if they are coming up after many days, many years, so you should be very, very careful to identify and eliminate this drug from the protocol. And it should be never used in children, because sometimes we see even children of congenital glaucoma have been given these drugs, and people can have profound CNS depression. We have seen people going into stupor and at times losing life because of use of brimonidine. Now, prostaglandins, they are again a very important class. They are metabolic products of arachidonic acid, which is a lipid. And there is a C1 carboxyl group, which is modified, which is here in almost all these groups. Based on this modification, they can be divided into ethylamides or isopropyl esters. So latanoprost, tavaprost, and neuroprostone are the esters, while bimatoprost is called as prostamide because of the addition of this amide ion here in this chain. So these chemical modifications make them more selective for their receptors and increase their bioavailability. And all these are prodrugs hydrolyzed to active drug in the cornea. They have been known to be active in the unconventional pathway. So they bind to their EP and FP receptors in the ciliary muscles. This results in ciliary muscle relaxation and increased aqueous humor outflow from the unconventional pathway. Now, what they do is they kind of create an imbalance between the metalloproteinases and the tissue inhibitor of these metalloproteinases. So when this imbalance is there, there is more degradation of extracellular matrix, and there is a reduced outflow resistance, causing increased aqueous outflow from the unconventional pathway. Now, this is a new theory where they have been known to act onto the conventional pathway also. So what happens is these are the prostaglandins receptors. Then there is a G protein independent pathway which causes activation of Rho, which causes formation of transcription factors. And then there is cell migration and cytoskeletal remodeling, causing conventional pathway to increase the outflow of these patients to the conventional outflow. Now, then we have this G protein dependent pathway, which causes stimulation of phospholipase C beta, which in turn causes accumulation of diacylglycerol, which causes activation of protein kinase C, formation of on the other pathway, it causes formation of inositol triphosphate, and through the calcium iron, the accumulation of calcium. Then there is increased transcription of RAS and RAF proteins, which in turn activate the mitogen activated protein kinase, and again go into the common factor of transcription factor and cell migration and cytoskeletal remodeling. Then we have got this epidermal growth factor receptor, which again causes, which again acts phospholipase C beta and protein mitogen activated protein kinase. They again have this common pathway of transcription factor being upregulated, and then there are changes in the cell migration and cytoskeletal remodeling. Now, these are the various drugs in their dosage, in their percentage, concentration available in the market, and they are all to be used once daily. Adverse reactions could be extraocular irritation causing contact dermatitis, conjunctival hyperemia, corneal toxicity. It can cause reactivation of herpes, pigmentation, lash growth, intraocular inflammation, and macular edema. Now, it is very important to understand that these are one of the most potent drugs and most commonly, now in fact, they can be called as first-line drugs in most of the glaucomas. But beware of intraocular inflammation, and they should not be used for 1 to 3 months following a cataract surgery or any other intraocular surgery. And keep a watch for macular edema, especially in patients who are aphakic and in cases which are complicated. Now, carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, the common ones are dorzolamide, brinzolamide, and acetazolamide. The mechanism of action is inhibition of carbonic anhydrase. This causes alteration in the ion transport and decrease in the aqueous humor secretion. Now, the diuretic effect because of the dorzolamide does not, acetazolamide does not contribute to the drop in the IOP. But yes, metabolic acidosis can cause reduction in the IOP because of these drugs. Acetazolamide and dorzolamide, they are also known to increase the retinal and optic nerve blood flow, but not the brinzolamide. Now, this is the dosage. The dosage of acetazolamide can be 10 to 20 milligrams per kilogram body weight in 2 to 4 divided dosage. And dorzolamide and brinzolamide are used thrice daily when alone, but in combination, they can be used twice daily. Now, adverse reactions could be paresthesias, increased urinary frequency, electrolyte imbalance, metabolic acidosis, potassium depletion, and GI abnormalities, and sulfur drug reactions on oral acetazolamide. And topical medications can give you a bitter taste, stinging irritation, transient blurred vision, hypersensitivity reaction, and periorbital dermatitis and corneal edema. Now, important thing to understand here is this is again a good add-on or an adjunct drug, but warn the patient of stinging and transient blurring with the use of these drugs. It should not be used in decompensated and compromised corneas because it will suppress the endothelial function further and cause precipitation of corneal decompensation. Now, Rho kinase inhibitors are a new entrant in this market. The commonly used are Repasudil and Etarsudil. The mechanism of action is that they enhance the conventional outflow facility. They are a new entrant, as we directly just now said. And Repasudil is used in the dosage of 0.4% twice daily, while Etarsudil is 0.02% once daily dosage. Now, they act on the trabecular meshwork. Before we understand how they work, we have to understand what is there in the trabecular meshwork. The trabecular meshwork expresses alpha smooth muscles, actin, myosin, ion channels, and G-coupled protein receptors. Now, physiological contractile agonists, growth factors, cytokines, they all have influence on the contractile properties of these alpha smooth muscles of the trabecular meshwork. Now, contraction decreases while the relaxation increases the outflow through the conventional outflow pathway. Depolarization, phosphorylation, and increased calcium tend to decrease the outflow through the Schlemm's canal and the trabecular meshwork. So we have myosin light chain, which causes phosphorylation by MLC kinase, which induces contraction. And then we have got other phosphorylation, which can cause change in the cell shape, cell adhesions, and cell-cell junctions of these trabecular meshwork cells. Now, what happens here is then we have these receptor tyrosine kinases, the extracellular matrix, and the lipophosphatic acid. They are all ligands. They combine with their receptors, the RTKs, the integrins, and the G-coupled protein receptors. They in turn activate the guanine nucleotide exchange factors, and then they activate the GTP as activating protein, and this in turn activates the Rho kinase. Now, what this Rho kinase does is it causes myosin light chain to myosin light chain phosphorylation by myosin light chain phosphorylase. So when this myosin light chain is dephosphorylated, it causes relaxation, cell shape changes, there is decreased stress on the actin fibers, decreased cell extracellular matrix adhesions, interactions, and decreased cell-cell junctions. So this causes increase in the aqueous outflow pathway. But when this phosphorylates, along with the CPS17 and actin, there is formation of cross-bridging, cell shape changes are there, there is increased adhesion of cell extracellular matrix interactions and increased cell-cell junctions. So this causes decrease in the aqueous outflow pathway or increased resistance. So whenever we inhibit Rho kinases, we have increase in the outflow pathway or decrease in the resistance. Now, these are the various adverse reactions. The common ones are hyperemia, conjunctivitis, and blepharitis with these drugs. Now, clinical tips, they are a new entrant in India. They are good adjunct. They have a newer mode of action. They have multiple actions. I have not gone into detail because they are known to be kind of neuroprotective, increasing the ocular blood flow, reducing the fibrosis and whatnot. They are well established in Japan and USA, but we have to see how they work in Indian population. Now, this drug tells you how much of drop we are expecting with each drug. So the best drop is seen with prostaglandins around 30 to 33%. Then comes timolol and brimonidine. So and then all other medications can cause around 20% reduction in IOP from the baseline, including these newer drugs like Repasudil and Etarsudil. Now, hyperosmotic agents. The commonly used are the mannitol and the glycerol. The mechanism of action is they tend to reduce the vitreous volume by change in the osmotic gradient. That means they pull out the water from the vitreous into the body fluids. there is a weak evidence that they act through centrally through hypothalamus and reduce IOP reduction by causing decrease in the aqueous formation. Now, dosage for mannitol is 1 to 2 milligrams per kilogram body weight in a 25% solution over 30 minutes. The onset of action is 20 to 60 minutes and lasts for about 2 to 6 hours. Glycerol is 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight or 2 to 3 cc per kilogram in a 50% solution. Onset is again 10 to 30 minutes and lasts for 5 to 6 hours. So whenever you are using these drugs, they last maximum for about 6 hours. They may be used around 3 to 4 times a day. But it is very important to understand that glycerol has a very high caloric content and mannitol is little more effective than glycerol. Adverse reactions could be nausea, vomiting, diuresis, cardiovascular overload because of these fluid overload, fever, chills, confusion, disorientation, anaphylactic shock, acidemia, pulmonary edema, and pulmonary edema can sometimes be so severe that you can even have a death of the patient. So they can only be used in emergency. Glycerol is not indicated for diabetics. Mannitol is not indicated in patients who have cardiac failure or poor myocardial function. They can be used only for short-term IOP control, but not long-term. So in a way, we have these many drugs which are available to control IOP, but they are to be very judiciously used, and how they are to be used, I think Dr. Manadeep is going to talk in the next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ankur. I can just, such a difficult topic to cover in such a short time. My video is not starting. Mr. Gupta, I think you have stopped my video. I'm unable to start my video.
No, sir, it's working. We have not stopped, sir.
I'm not able to start my video. It's okay. That's not an issue, but thank you, Doctor. Am I audible?
Yeah. We can hear you.
Thank you so much. We don't have any questions at this moment, but 1 or 2 points, I think you made some very practical tips for the students. One point which you raised, that less than 7 years brimonidine should not be used. This is something we have seen so often. Even young patients, young children are given brimonidine. So just for the postgraduates, if you have a patient of say 3-year or 4-year-old kid with high pressures, what is your preferred drug for these patients?
Yeah, I think the preferred drug usually is timolol, and based upon the other factors, like if you have non-inflammatory kind of glaucoma, the prostaglandins can also be used in children. And what we see mostly children in the children young age group is either a steroid-induced glaucoma or a developmental or a congenital glaucoma. Now, congenital glaucoma presents very early, which is very, less than 1 year, maybe few months of age. And the most risky patients are these patients who have been put on these drugs like brimonidine. And we have seen even death in RP center when people have been referred to us with brimonidine on, and we had to rush the patient to the emergency and we tried to save some patients, and we just could not save these patients because they went into profound CNS depressions. So for children, the safest drugs could be a prostaglandin, a beta blocker, or maybe to a certain extent carbonic anhydride inhibitor. So these 3 drugs can be used. I don't know what will the situation of Rho kinase inhibitors, but yes, they can also be used in steroid-induced glaucomas. So because they work in the area where the steroid-induced glaucoma actually works, actually causes the glaucoma.
Another very important point you raised, that there is a risk of corneal decompensation when you're using a topical carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. So if you have a patient where a penetrating keratoplasty has been done, these cases, maybe we need to avoid drugs like dorzolamide. In these cases, will you consider using something like a brinzolamide in place of dorzolamide, or you will totally avoid carbonic anhydrase inhibitors?
Look, the best is to avoid carbonic anhydrase. The best is to absolutely avoid, because they all kind of further deteriorate the endothelial cell function. And now with the advent of Rho kinase inhibitors, maybe we can add these drugs up. I've been kind of shifting most of the patients where there's a contraindication for any other drug to these kinds of drugs. But we have brimonidine, we have timolol, even prostaglandins can be used in a quiet eye following a PK. So, and even pilocarpine can be used in these patients because sometimes they already have a lot of iris abnormalities, so people will not constrict, and maybe people can tolerate these drugs. So we try and avoid carbonic anhydrase inhibitors post PK patients.
Thank you so much. I think we'll move on to Dr. Manadeep sir's presentation. Just one last question. A lot of time I've seen the prostaglandin, they find it difficult to finalize the dose of mannitol and glycerol. So one practical, so if you have a 50-year-old gentle, 50 kilogram weight male patient, how you calculate the dose of mannitol or even glycerol? Just practically you can share with me.
Normally, like what I have in my mind is I have taken a weight of 60 kilograms as a young adult.
Okay, 60,
So for a
fine.
60 kilograms, we think about giving a full bottle of mannitol, which is 350 cc, 20% mannitol. And we can give 500 milligrams of acetazolamide up to 4 times a day, and glycerol as 30 cc 3 times a day. So now you just kind of reduce proportionately with the weight, and you can keep it on the lower side, in fact, especially the acetazolamide, because even 250 milligrams twice a day sometimes causes all these paresthesias, tingling, numbness, and GI upset. So for glycerol and mannitol, you can calculate that way. So you can kind of think about 50 kilograms and extrapolate that. I remember 60 as a kind of thing.
I use a formula that what is the body weight, I multiply by 5. So if 50 kilogram into 5 becomes 250 ml of mannitol, you can give out 20%. So we all need to have a working formula, because suddenly when you get an emergency, then you keep calculating the dose, which becomes difficult.
Yeah.
So Satish sir,
I follow the same formula as Manish.
Thank you so much. Satish sir,
Thank you so much, Dr. Ankur, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. We are really, really indebted to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving me the
really, I can see the amount of hard work it has gone to prepare this presentation.
He has covered the entire topic very well, very well. Thank you so much. Next, we have with us, next speaker is Dr. Manavdeep Singh. Sir, we are absolutely blessed to have you with us. We are very, very grateful to you for your time that you have given and for the blessings that you have given to this program. Professor Manavdeep Singh is the Professor of Ophthalmology and Head of Glaucoma Services at RML Hospital, New Delhi. He is the Treasurer of the Glaucoma Society of India. He is the Library Officer for Delhi Ophthalmological Society, and he is a member of the National Task Force of Glaucoma. In the past, he was the Joint Secretary of Delhi Ophthalmic Society, and presently he is the Executive Member of the Glaucoma Society of India and Delhi Ophthalmic Society both. Dr. Manavdeep Singh did his fellowship in glaucoma from LV Prasad Eye Institute in 2002. He has received the Louis Victor Rombo Award for Best Junior Resident in 1988 and the Best Video Film Award.
Sir, I think so much of introduction is not required, sir. Let us go on to the work.
Sir, give me 2 minutes. It's an honor for us to have you, sir. And all the students, postgraduates, Pan India should know all our respected seniors, sir. He got the Video Film Award for his film on Goldman Applanation Tonometry. He has contributed chapters in 4 books and has 4 international and 17 other publications. He has been an examiner in number of postgraduate examinations in Indian University and on faculty of DNB. He has been a reviewer and editorial board of Delhi Journal of Ophthalmology and DOS Times. We are so blessed to have you, sir, with us. It's an absolute honor and pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for giving your time, sir. Dr. Manish Singh, please.
Yes, before sir has already given a lovely introduction, but one point I like to tell all the PGs, you can go to YouTube and you can see applanation tonometry video, which Dr. Manavdeep Singh sir has prepared, and I think most of us should watch that video. It's a lovely video on applanation tonometry, and almost everything what is required for practical life and exam both are nicely covered in the video. So sir, I think we are looking forward to your presentation, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Satyajit, Dr. Manish, and thank you, Ankur, for creating a base for my practical talk. You have given all the theory, so I'll share my slides. And so what I'll be discussing about the practical protocols. This is very, very practical talk as opposed to Ankur. He has created it for me, and we'll be focusing on the medical management. This slide, my slide is not going forwards.
We can see your slides, sir.
Yes.
Fine.
Now it's moving.
So first of all, we have to evaluate the glaucoma, and for evaluation, we check up the intraocular pressure. We do the optic disc examination, which has to be necessarily by 3D. 2D examination is not enough. So the best lens which I prefer is a 78D lens, although you can use the magnification of the slit lamp and use a different lens, 90D or so. Central corneal thickness is absolutely essential in today's era, gonioscopy, visual fields. So these are the essential components of any evaluation for glaucoma. OCT is becoming more common and more important. However, it has got very little role in established glaucoma. Its role is mainly in the glaucoma before the glaucoma is established and you have pre-perimetric state of glaucoma and glaucoma suspect, where you need to demonstrate progression in glaucoma. Based on single OCT, you can never start the treatment. The treatment has to be based on, in case you are talking of the structural changes, you have to demonstrate the progression unless the functional changes, that is the field changes, have already set in. So the goals of therapy, goals of the therapy are is to prevent. The purpose of treatment as per the World Glaucoma Association guidelines and also the European Glaucoma guidelines are, it is to prevent visual disability during the lifetime of the patient without significantly disturbing his quality of life and at a reasonable cost. So our aim to treat the patient is to prevent visual disability and not just to treat the intraocular pressure or something else. So the decision to treat should consider the age of the patient, the family history, intraocular pressure at the baseline, central corneal thickness, presence of other problems like pseudoexfoliation, disc hemorrhage, functional integrity of optic nerve head at the time of diagnosis, and that of RNFL, which is the same thing. Assessment of the treatment over a period of time also needs to be done, and it requires the checkup of intraocular pressure, the visual function and structural changes, and also the quality of life. The rate of progression is of fundamental importance because that's what decides. There are certain patients who may not progress despite very little therapy or no therapy for 10, 20, 30 years, and there are others which may progress very fast despite a good control of IOP. So we have to rule out secondary glaucomas in these patients also, but I want to tell you one thing about the secondary glaucomas, that is the steroid-induced and the pseudoexfoliation glaucoma. They behave exactly like primary open-angle glaucoma and to be treated like that. However, in most of the other secondary glaucomas, pilocarpine is contraindicated and atropine is the drug of choice, which I have seen the prescriptions with pilocarpine in neovascular glaucoma, which is a strict contraindication. The drug of choice for the treatment of NVG and uveitis is not ocular hypotensives, but atropine. So coming to the primary adult glaucomas, the open angle glaucoma and angle closure glaucoma, we'll be studying the management protocols. And the protocols is basically in 2 slides in each of these 2 talks of open angle and angle closure. And if you understand these 2 slides, there's no difference between you and me. Glaucoma is a complex disease, no doubt. But at the same time, the medical treatment of glaucoma is nothing but an arithmetical fact. It's a theorem. You know the theorem and you can solve every question based on this. And which I'll make you understand that after the end of this lecture, you will be able to treat 99.9% of the patients without consulting your consultant. The medical management is the mainstay of therapy, as you know. And in primary angle closure or primary angle closure glaucoma, we need to do peripheral iridotomy and then we treat the patient just like primary open angle glaucoma. However, the surgery here is required more often and it is less responsive to treatment, whether it is medical or surgical, and also the complications are more. The target IOP is to be decided. Why? Because this is the only modifiable risk factor. As per the World Glaucoma Association consensus, it is an IOP range when estimated rate of progression is unlikely to affect the vision related quality of life. This means that the loss of ganglion cells or the loss of function is just equivalent to that of the physiological age related loss of the function. So this is what our aim is, and how to we decide, that is based on certain factors which are involved: the amount of glaucomatous damage, intraocular pressure at which damage has occurred, life expectancy of the patient at the time of diagnosis, status of the fellow eye, and family history of severe glaucoma. Severe is the keyword. Family history of glaucoma is generally not significant. It is a severe glaucoma or blindness from glaucoma which is significant in deciding the treatment modalities. The target IOP requires ongoing re-evaluation because, as I told you, it is the speed of the progression of glaucoma which is most important. And in case the speed is more, you have to lower the target IOP, otherwise you may have to stabilize it or increase it also sometimes. And the benefits and risk of escalating the treatment must balance. This is a classical diagram taken from the European Glaucoma Society Guidelines 2014, and it shows that this is a normal physiological loss. Here, in the case of glaucoma, the damage has already taken place up to this level, and this is a line parallel to this line. So this is what we need to achieve when we are deciding about the target pressure. The general guidelines include it should be kept in high teens when the damage is early at high intraocular pressure. Suppose there is a little damage and the patient has come to you with 35-40 pressure, then your target will be high. In a low risk patient, low risk means the systemic risk factors of the reduced blood flow, like any cardiovascular problems or any atherosclerosis in the carotid arteries. It has to be kept in mid-teens when the damage is moderate at high intraocular pressure in low to moderate risk patient. It should be in low teens when there is an advanced damage at high intraocular pressure in a moderate risk patient or moderate to high risk in a high risk patient. It should be below teens, that is 10 to 12. Below 10 is not possible because that is the episcleral pressure and we cannot go below the episcleral pressure. So it should be below teens in advanced damage at low pressure in a high risk patient. So the guiding principles of drug therapy are the efficacy of drug should be minimum 15 degrees reduction in intraocular pressure. If the improvement reduction is less than this, then we don't call the drug as effective. The cost should be affordable, dosage should be convenient, there should be low adverse effects, and all these things improve the compliance and the adherence. The systemic side effects should be minimized, and they can be further minimized by lowering the concentration of the drug if it is possible, or by doing the nasolacrimal duct obstruction, which should be taught to every patient at the time of initial diagnosis. I have a video on YouTube how to apply eye drops, which you people can see and exactly know how exactly to do this. The general principles of treatment are: start with a single drug, do a unilateral trial so that you know the efficacy of the drug. I don't have that strict protocol, but like places like Shankar Nethralaya, they have a very strict protocol. Even if the patient comes with a 35-40 millimeters of mercury bilateral, initially they generally start with a unilateral trial. So you can stick to it if you want. I don't strictly stick to this. Then the next thing is switch within the same group if there are side effects or in case there is a poor control, followed by addition from another drug and this addition should preferably be with a drug of different mechanism of action. And generally, patients are not compliant when more than 2 bottles are prescribed. Now we have the advantage of fixed drug combinations of different kinds, and we can use 4 drugs in 2 bottles. And next add-on is always less effective. If you started with PG analogs, it may reduce IOP by 35%. However, if you started with timolol and then you add on PG analog, then the next effect may be only 15 to 20%, and so on and so forth. The 4th drug may be only 5% effective. So keep the patient informed about the patient possible side effect. That's very, very important. Unless the patient knows that the side effects, patient will not present to you with these side effects, even if he'll keep on suffering and keep on having the exaggeration of the side effects. As Dr. Ankur said, hyperosmotic agents should be used only in the mechanism of action has been told to you by Dr. Ankur. I'll not go into details, but I would like to stress that the new drugs which he told us, they have multiple mechanisms of actions. The groups of drugs you have already been told, so I'll not go into details. So the beginning of therapy, how do we begin? What is the choice of the drug? As I said, we start with a single drug. The drug should have maximum efficacy, high compliance, that means low side effects and low frequency of installation. Cost should be reasonable. PG analogs and beta blockers are generally the first choice and may add a but you should start with a single drug. In case the pressure is very high and you are afraid that a single drug will not be able to bring the pressure and the disease is advanced, and you may lose retinal ganglion cells every day with this high pressure. So what you can do is, you can say you prescribe a PG analog, you give it once a day, start with a single drug, but to this add acetazolamide, systemic drug. You give it for 5 days, to call the patient after 7 days, because in the last 2 days the drug of the systemic drug will be totally over, the effect will be over, and then you can assess how much the PG analog is acting, so that you really know how much this drug is really effective. And unilateral trial I told you. So the obvious first choice in today's date is PG analogs. Please take my word, they are not expensive because they are used once a day, and we do have Indian drugs available which are as effective as the foreign made drugs. So they are not expensive at all. And for the reduction of the cost, what you can do is, whatever generic name you want to prescribe, you can always take a bottle of the sample and count the number of drops, because some people will say it is 3 ml in place of 2.5 ml. It does not matter how many ml are there. What matters is the number of drops. So you take a bottle, count the drops yourself before prescribing the drug, so that you know how much it is going to last. Why they are the first choice? Because they are once a day. They have practically nil systemic side effects. IOP fall is very high, but we should take it that in case they are 20%, the fall is less than 20% as the first line, then you can take that they are non-responsive, because 10% of the general population is non-responsive to these drugs. They can be combined with practically all groups of drugs, and the contraindications, as Dr. Ankul said, are the macular edema of any cause, intraocular inflammation, recent surgery, and these are the contraindications. Side effects include hyperemia, eyelash growth, orbital fat atrophy, and periocular pigmentation. This orbital fat atrophy I specifically want to stress, because it is generally not stressed at most of the places. The patient comes to you with a very deep set eyes, and they become further deep, and this is generally not reversible when you stop the drug. So you have to keep the patient informed that in case this happens, and what in my practice, travoprost is the most notorious for this. The beta blockers are the second choice. I'll not go into the details of these side effects. The only thing which I would like to say is tachyphylaxis. If used alone, this generally becomes less effective in 2 years' time or so. Alpha agonists are the next choice. Singly used, they are required 3 times a day, and they are reasonable reduction in the intraocular pressure. When used in combination, they twice a day is good enough. And there is higher frequency of side effects, as Dr. Ankur said, that 1.5 to 2 years, brimonidine can really cause a lot of side effects and allergic reaction, periocular reactions, ocular surface, and if they are not recognized, then it can lead to even bilateral or in whatever eye the drug is being used, granulomatous uveitis. That generally happens if the drug after side effects is not, it still is continued for weeks to months. So we should keep the patients informed about the possibility of these side effects of these drugs. Alpha-2 agonists may have an effect on the epicellular venous pressure, and hence they are supposed to be a little better in normal tension glaucoma. I think on rest of the things, yes, this carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, they are sulfa group of drugs, so any sulfa allergy, they should not be used. Pilocarpine is my favorite. It has got many side effects. It's difficult to use. It is very little prescribed, but still this is the ultimate drug. Believe me, not only angle closure glaucoma, even in open angle glaucoma, when nothing works, this drug works. I have seen patients in which they were not responding to any treatment, surgery was not feasible. The moment they were open angle glaucoma patient, the moment I prescribed pilocarpine, their pressures came down 20%, 30%. The common side effects include Brovec, miosis and its related problems, and induced myopia. These problems are much more with anticholinesterase drugs rather than the pilocarpine, which is the only drug which is now in practical use. So the treatment algorithm. These are the 2 most important slides about the algorithms. So start with a PG analog, and the most innocuous. Suppose a patient is prone to allergies, the most innocuous has been the latanoprost till now, but now it is a tefloprost which has now become available in India. Bimatoprost, travoprost, they are supposed to be a little more effective, but I don't believe they are equally effective, and they have got many more side effects. Among the beta blockers, non-selective beta blockers are more effective and have got more side effects as well, systemic side effects. When one requires more than one drug, I prefer, and everybody prefers, fixed dose combinations over the individual drugs. This is because of the convenience and to minimize the preservative related side effects. Although most of the side effects are from the drug itself, less are from preservatives, but those from preservatives, they are reduced. And of course, the cost is also less, and it all leads to better compliance. And if the target is not achieved with 2 bottles or there is intolerance to drugs, surgery is the answer. So this slide, I think this slide, if you remember by heart, then there is no difference between PG and a consultant, glaucoma consultant. So please take note of this slide appropriately and understand it. It is only the same thing which we have discussed in the previous few slides. You start with a PG analog. There are 2 possibilities, either the target IOP is achieved or it is not achieved. If it is achieved, the drug is either well tolerated or it is not tolerated. If it is well tolerated, target pressure has already been achieved, you continue with the drug, and this is the treatment you are giving. And if it is not tolerated, then what do? Then you switch within the group. Do not change the group, because it is not essential that if a person is intolerant to bimatoprost or to travoprost, will be intolerant only or to latanoprost as well. So you can always switch within the same group. And if it is still not tolerated, then you change the group of the medicine. And again, if it is target IOP is achieved, and then if it is well tolerated, you continue. If it is not tolerated, then you go ahead with the same system. Now you have started with PG analog and the target IOP is not achieved. So what do? You switch within the group, first thing. Again, if one PG analog is not effective, it does not mean that all the PG analogs will not be effective. So switch within the group. If it is target IOP is achieved, then again you go to the same cycle. And if it is within the group, if you have switched and the target IOP is still not achieved, then you see how much is the fall. If the fall is less than 20%, then you feel that this is not effective and you change the drug. And if the IOP fall is more than 15%, then you add another drug. So a word about pregnancy. The 4 categories which have been defined by American Academy of Ophthalmology based on FDA. Category 1, there is proven no risk, and these are the categories, and the A, B, C, D category, and there is a progressive increase in the risk. Category B, the only drug we have is brimonidine. So this is the drug of choice in pregnancy. However, this cannot be used in lactation and in pediatric age group, as told by Dr. Ankur. Most of the drugs, they belong to, they are in the category C. And best is to avoid all drugs in pregnancy, and SLT can be a good thing if it is available. Or otherwise, you can in the second trimester go ahead with surgery also if there is an uncontrolled intraocular pressure. Recently, we had a case presentation in which there were multiple congenital anomalies in the born baby because the patient has been on oral acetazolamide for in the first trimester. So this is these drugs are really very bad in the early pregnancy. In lactation and pediatric age group, I think Dr. Ankur has covered. But just one thing which was not covered, I would like to say that aqueous suppressant like beta blockers, they are more effective than PG analogs in pediatric age group as opposed to the adult population. About the compliance, a word about compliance, that poor adherence and discompliance are major issues because 70% of the patient doses are generally taken, not full doses are taken. Self-report of adherence is often overestimated, and the lower compliance is in the age up higher age group and patients of depression and physical and mental barriers. Thus, to summarize, medical management is the mainstay of medical management of primary adult glaucomas. Target IOP should be defined before starting the treatment in NEI, and it should be written on the records of the patient. Stepwise treatment starting with a single drug with switch over and then add approach is the way to go. treatment of each patient should be individualized. Treatment regime should be simplified for the best compliance. So new compliance, new drugs I will not go, because Dr. Ankur has already covered this. The new drugs and new combination preservative-free drugs, new drug delivery system, new therapies, these are available. But if I just want to say a word about these drugs which are newly available drugs. These have been recently Natrosodil and a combination with Natrosodil. They have been recently, FDA approved, but they are extremely expensive. In India, they cost around 20,000 per bottle. And Rifampicin, which is available in India, it is difficult to use because it is twice a day doses and is less effective. So we are still in India not, able to use these drugs. So the multiple mechanisms of action, as I told, and Dr. Ankur also clarified. So this is another drug which is a nitric oxide donating PG alpha 2 agonist, latanoprostene benot. This is also FDA approved. It relaxes the trabecular meshwork, and by multiple mechanisms of action, it is more effective than the PG analogs. This, as I told you, is now available in India and available in the Unims form also, and they are extremely innocuous. A patient who is allergic to all possible medicine, you can use the Unims of this drug, no financial interest. So thank you very much. This was about the open angle, and now I'll go to the angle closure. Can you see this
Yeah, we can
presentation?
see.
Yes, sir.
So similarly, here also there will be 2-3 key slides which will, the PG will become consultant immediately after, remembering those 2-3 slides.
So you can share the slides also with them.
Why not? I'll share. People can take picture or the recorded version they can see later.
Not the whole presentation. Does 2-3 slides.
Okay, you mean time is less?
No, sir, no issues. You can please carry on.
Okay, then I'll go with my presentation. So the definition, first the definition, occludable angles. If there are only occludable angles and nothing else is there, then it is known as primary angle closure suspect. In primary angle closure glaucoma, there is evidence of past closure, and in primary angle closure glaucoma, there will, apart from past angle closure, the IOP is raised and there are disc and field changes. So disc and field changes, this is what decides about the definition of primary angle closure glaucoma. In primary angle closure, there is either evidence of past angle closure or there is raised intraocular pressure or both, but there are no disc and field changes. In PSCS, everything is normal except the occludable angle. So this is an example of a position angle. You can't see any structure. These are the synechiae. And this is a blotchy pigmentation. This picture has been taken from L.V. Prasad archives, and this is very characteristic of past evidence of past angle closure. So there are various mechanisms which can lead to the mechanism of angle closure, but the pupillary block is the only one which is corrected by laser iodotomy, because here the purpose of PI is to bypass the pupil in case of pupillary block. In other types of mechanisms, PI is not effective. And I'll not go into these details because time is short. So this is something I want to tell you about the indications of peripheral iodotomy. It has to be done in all cases of PSC and PSCG. However, in PSCS, in India, I think we have almost 5 to 10% population which has got PSCS, and all these people cannot undergo laser. So we have to be very selective in these, and only 5% of them will go to primary angle closure glaucoma, not even visually disabling glaucoma. So it is not to be done in every case. So these are the indications. Fellow eyes of the patients in which acute attack of primary angle closure glaucoma has taken place, because the other eye is also prone to it. If there is a critically narrow angle, say to the tune of less than 10 degree, or clinically on gonioscopy, only Schwalbe's line is visible and no trabecular meshwork is visible. Even if on indentation you can see the trabecular meshwork. So symptomatic patient. So what are the symptoms of angle closure? The symptom of angle closure is early low-grade brow ache one side coming in the evening, which goes away with sleep. NSAIDs may not have any benefit, but the sleep induces meiosis. So after sleeping, the patient becomes all right. And another thing is you should look carefully for the pupillary rough changes. These may be signs of the past angle closure attacks. Glaucoma flecans again may be a sign of the past angle closure. And if a patient is come from village, cannot come for follow-up, again you should err on the side of doing PI rather than not doing PI. Because once glaucoma sets in, angle closure glaucoma sets in, it's very, very difficult to treat medically as well as surgically. In case there is a need for frequent dilatation, like in case of retinal diseases, again you should go ahead with early PI. Selection of location is basically crypts. Crypts are the location, nothing else matters really. Although typically it is said that supranasal is the best location, but it generally doesn't matter. The only thing is this: one should avoid extreme peripheral location, because failure is common due to poor location in arcus in the or the presence of pannus in the peripheral portion. It may cause iridodialysis. It has happened in my hands also. Assessment of its patency after it has been done every time is very, very difficult. Every time you will feel that it is blocked, and you will do gorioscopy, or you will put the patient on pilocarpine to be able to understand whether it is patent or not. One should avoid very, very central location, because if it remains in the collarate area, then it closes immediately after having been become patent, and also can cause diplopia. The preparation for YAG laser PI is at least 2 readings should be taken with the GAT, so that you know what exactly is the status of the intraocular pressure. Pilocarpine 2% eye drops are instilled few times. This is not specific how many times. The only purpose is the pupil should be non-reacting at the time of doing throwing the laser light. So it should be non-reacting. The patient is examined especially to look for iris crypts. The laser should be done at the level of crypts. In case crypts are absent, one should use the drumstick technique of sequential double frequency YAG. Double frequency YAG is same as argon, to be followed by YAG laser in the center of that. One should always use an iridotomy lens for this purpose, for the focus and for the stability of the eye and focus of the laser light. Generally, I prefer to use a single shot. Some people prefer 2-3 shots to reach the full thickness. I prefer a single shot for penetration. However, the size of the PI can be increased with next 3 shots, 3, 4, 5 shots of a little lesser energy. The signs of achieved patency include a gush of aqueous from the posterior chamber. Red glow is not very definitive, because a thin if layer of iris is there, then again the red glow can come. Visibility of ciliary processes is again a short sign, but they'll be visible only when the PI is of large size. I prefer using a low potency steroid which is used for 7 days, and pilocarpine to keep the PI patent, and by stretching the iris for 5 days. 5 days, and this is 7 days, because I examine the patient after 7 days, and by that time I want the effect of the pilocarpine to be over, and I want the patient to come to me in a physiological state. The post-laser management, I have told you about the loteprednol and pilocarpine, and no ocular hypotensive agents are generally required unless a very high energy to the tune of 80 millijoules or so has been used, or in case it's a very advanced case of glaucoma. We have done 4 studies back to back and published and got prizes in the conferences for presenting these, and we have really proven that the most of the literature, this is against most of the literature available in the world, and these are really not required in our eyes. I'm very, very sure about this. After this, we should check the intraocular pressure at 1 hour, 1 day and 1 week following the PI. The alpha agonists are most effective. Apraglutinin is no more available because it caused a lot of tachyphylaxis, and so it has been withdrawn from market. Brimonidine is available. These are most effective in case there is a post-laser spike, which you have. So this is another very, very important slide, very, very important, and post-PI evaluation at 1 week. So this is the protocol. First, you check the patency of the iridotomy, then measure the intraocular pressure. If the PI is patent, do gonioscopy to assess how much the angle has opened, and for the better assessment of the peripheral anterior synechiae which are present. So you can do indentation or manipulation and then assess the presence of synechiae. After that, you should dilate the patient with tropicamide, not with a combination. I'll tell you why. And a mid-dilated IOP has to be recorded. Mid-dilated IOP, as all of you know, is the most important because the vectors work in a way that IOP is highest in these cases when the pupil is mid-dilated. And if you use a combination with phenylephrine, then there are two harms. One is that it dilates fully, and secondly, there is no antidote available in case the patient goes into acute attack. Thirdly, the dilatation is very, very quick, so the patient does not go into acute attack, whereas the constriction, which is a physiological phenomena, happens slowly, and the contact period with the lens is increased, and the patient, and that generally happens 3 to 4 hours after having used it. So once the patient goes home, that's the time when the patient goes into acute attack, and you are not able to control. If the patient has gone, say, 50 or 100 kilometers away, then the patient will have to come back in the acute attack. Very, very difficult to manage. After having dilated the patient, pupils, you dilated examination should be done for the appropriate assessment of the disc. Undilated examination of the disc is always, always incomplete, howsoever expert the person may be. Phenylephrine is to be avoided, as I told you, and this is done. So this is the protocol, this is the slide which I have devised, and this slide makes, a consultant from PG to consultant in a single slide. So what do? Patient comes to you and you do gonioscopy and the angles are occludable. Then you define the patient, whether the patient has PACS or PAC or PACG. So in case it is a PAC or PACG, you always do PI. Take IOP at 1 hour and 1 day, follow up in 1 week. If it is non-patent, you again repeat the procedure, and this should be done. Some people feel that it should be done a week later once the inflammation has subsided. No. Inflammation will lead to posterior synechia formation. So the PI should be done immediately. Maybe suppose there's shaping or there's pigment dispersion, you should do it in half an hour time or maximum next day. And you should give a lot of topical steroids to reduce the inflammation, and then do it as early as possible. Do not wait for a week for the inflammation to subside. And if it is patent, then you take the intraocular pressure, do gonioscopy, do mid-dilated IOP and dilated disc examination. In PACS cases, it has to be done only in cases indicated, as I have already told you, and then everything else remains the same. In plateau iris syndrome, this is one of the cases in which the pupillary block is not the mechanism of action. And how do we define in the absence of UBM? UBM most of the people don't have, and it is difficult to use. In case IOP rises on dilatation of pupil in the absence of synechia, then it is a case of plateau iris syndrome. This is simple definition. IOP rises on dilatation of pupil in the absence of synechia. Synechia not present, still on dilatation, the patient has a high IOP. Now, what are the options when this happens? Argon laser rhinoplasty, long-term use of pilocarpine because it will keep the peripheral iris stretched and the angle will remain open, or trabeculectomy. In case there are no disc field changes, you will like to definitely avoid trabeculectomy. And so these are the two options which remain. The most important criteria to decide in favor of surgery is the presence of definite field defects. As I told you, this is the functional defect that we treat. We do not treat the structural defect unless we are very sure about the diagnosis of glaucoma. Our aim is to prevent visual disability, so we treat the functional aspect of it. In case of angle crowding as a mechanism of plateau iris or extensive PES, PI will not be effective. Right? PI will not be effective. Either there are extensive PS or if the mechanism is a non-pupillary block mechanism. In case IOP does not rise on dilatation of the pupil, further management is like that of a primary open angle glaucoma. That means if the baseline IOP is normal, you need not treat the patient. However, the follow-up for life is essential. Whereas in case the baseline IOP is high, then you treat the patient with drugs, and if not controlled with drugs, you go with trabeculectomy. A word about the acute attack of glaucoma. Intravenous mannitol should be given immediately. Why the patient goes into acute attack? Something which we have to understand, and the IOP does not come. This is because on pupillary block, these eyes are generally in the pre-existing relative pupillary block. So once there is a reason for the pupil to get dilated little bit, say by excitement, by watching horror movies, by taking coffee, or because of emotional upset, or because of just simply because of dark area, sitting in dark, the pupil dilates a little bit and the IOP goes beyond 40. Once it goes above 40, there occurs uh, ischemia of the pupillary sphincter. Once the sphincter becomes ischemic, it will stop responding to anything, including the meiosis caused by sleep. So it will not respond to any treatment. So the patient will go into acute attack. And when the patient comes to you, that time also it will not respond to treatment unless you have brought the pressure to below 40 millimeters of mercury with the help of hyperosmotic agents. So once it has come down to 40, then you can start pilocarpine. There are various different people say different regime. The purpose is basically to constrict the pupil. So the treatment of acute ACG is to constrict the pupil. How you do it, that is up to you. And the most common mechanism is bring down the pressure to a level where pilocarpine becomes effective, then use pilocarpine, and then make the constrict the pupil with whatever frequency it is possible. You have to constrict the pupil and keep watching the patient. The patient should remain under observation till the pupil constricts, and once the pupil constricts, patient will not go into acute attack later on. So you can take your time to do laser PI then. Oral acetazolamide tablet can be given, but remember, whenever you give oral acetazolamide in any form, in any dose, supplementation of potassium is important. If it is up to 3 tablets a day, you can give physiological things like mosmi juice or banana, or addition of the two things. Mosmi juice is the most effective. And in case it is more than 3 tablets a day, then you have to use supplementation in the form of pot chlorine or tablets of potassium. And in case you are using or any potassium supplementation, lot of water has to be given. Like pot chlor, 2 teaspoonfuls, they have to be put in full glass of water. You cannot give the patient a teaspoonful and then give water. They have to be mixed. Otherwise, they can cause horrors. And I know of a patient who died because of the hypokalemia, leading to cardiac arrhythmias and sudden death in a patient. So in case you are giving it for more than 5 days, you should keep a watch on the serum potassium levels. Topical steroids are given 4 times a day to reduce inflammation, so that PI can be done later on. So if you last 1 or 2 slides, PI can, once it is done, the cornea is clear and inflammation is controlled. That is the time when PI should be done. The oral acetazolamide is to be withdrawn as soon as possible. Topical hypotensive treatment is added in case required. In occasional cases, the pupil does not constrict with pilocarpine. It becomes fixed dilated, and it is very difficult, and the cornea is hazy and edematous. So carefully done paracentesis.
Sir, your audio is not coming.
Suddenly the audio just went off, sir.
Yeah, I think the audio is. I think by mistake you have muted your mic. So you microphone. Just unmute it.
Sir, unmute your mic, sir. You need to unmute your mic.
Dr. Manav, please, sir, unmute your mic. Sir. डॉक्टर मानवदीप सिंह सर, आपका माइक
Can you see my slide now?
We can see your slide.
And audio also?
Yes, sir.
Audio is fine. Audio is fine.
Okay. So the other thing is iris, the argon laser peripheral iridoplasty. Argon laser peripheral iridoplasty is a procedure to induce immediate focal iris stromal contraction to pull the iris root away from the angle wall and thus widening it. Generally, it is indicated in plateau iris because PI is not effective. Clear lens extraction is preferred by some in case of IOP, by some people in case the IOP remains high after PI despite drugs, or if PI cannot be performed in a particular case. Trabeculectomy in ACG versus POAG, there are higher complications as I told you, and there is high risk of shallow AC, surgical failure, malignant glaucoma, and significant rate of cataract formation. Just a slide about concept of lens extraction, because it is a discussion nowadays. Lens extraction is completely removes the pupillary block and alleviates the angle crowding caused by thick and anteriorly placed lens. This is the concept. Removing the lens creates more space in the anterior chamber and widens the angle. The probable indications include probable. I am not sure about these indications. If the amount of Seneca cannot explain the rise of IOP and IOP is constantly high in the presence of patent peripheral iridotomy, the angle is critically narrow, and if the lens watt is high as tested on anterior segment OCT. Thus, to summarize, in the presence of cataract, threshold for lens extraction is lowered. However, in IOP, angle by indentation, gonioscopy, and optic nerve head should be monitored after laser peripheral iridoplasty, peripheral iridotomy, and patient should be treated as POAG after this. If the angle is opened following peripheral iridotomy and IOP visual fields as well as optic nerve head are normal, no further treatment is indicated, but lifelong follow-up remains essential in angle closure glaucoma, because these patients can anytime develop further angle closure, or a PI can close and they can result in rise of IOP. When the synechial angle closure is extensive, or if the IOP is high despite medical therapy, filtration surgery should be considered. When there is significant appositional closure or early synechial closure associated with shallow AC and with persistently elevated IOP despite maximal tolerated medical therapy or progressive optic neuropathy, the lens extraction may be an option. If sequential surgery is planned, I mean both trabeculectomy as well as cataract surgery, trabeculectomy can be done 1 month post cataract surgery. However, trabeculectomy should be delayed for 6 months, ideally 2 years following cataract extraction to reduce the chance of failure. So, in case both surgeries have to be done sequentially, one should always do cataract surgery before the glaucoma surgery. Thank you very much for the patience listening, and sorry for exceeding my time.
No, sir, not at all. Thank you so much, sir. Actually, you have really covered in detail all the and most of the practical points you have already shared. There were some questions which already Dr. Ankur has answered, but just for the sake of conclusion, I just thought I'll just ask a few questions which to summarize, because we have another 10 minutes. So we were talking about a role of pilocarpine. So very quickly, sir, you highlighted it's a very wonder drug. So definitely in angle closure, open angle. So for exam point of view, what are the key indications they should mention while using pilocarpine?
See, the first indication is in acute attack of angle closure. Everybody knows this. Then in case the PI has to be delayed because of any reason, like in a fellow eye, like nowadays lockdown, a patient says, oh, I was given an appointment for this, so the patient is put on pilocarpine. So because of any reason whatsoever, if the PI has to be delayed, then the fellow eye has to any eye in which you have taken a decision to do laser PI, and the laser has to be delayed because of any reason, you have to give pilocarpine. So these are the indications in case of plateau iris.
I think these three are really very important from.
These are the things, and in any open angle glaucoma, where drugs are not being effective, drugs have got side effects, patients are not tolerating. Before going to surgery, you can always give a trial of pilocarpine. Of course, this cannot be given for very long, otherwise there will be other problems, and but you can delay the surgery by 6 months, 1 year time in open angle.
Very practical point. So there is a question: can we do lens extraction in plateau iris syndrome?
I told you very clearly that some people do it, but there should. It is not an accepted procedure. Although there are few proponents of this worldwide, but most of the people do not agree that only by virtue of, suppose a patient had an acute attack of glaucoma, the pupil is now fixed dilated, and nothing is happening, you are not able to do PI, and there's little bit cataract, or it is acutely shallow AC and the cataract is going to develop. These are the cases in which you should go ahead with clear lens extraction. But otherwise, do not take this as a glaucoma surgery. It is not a glaucoma
Just
surgery.
pure plateau iris syndrome is not an indication for surgery.
Not at all.
We have to see other factors. One
Yes,
point
yes.
you mentioned, sir, very high lens vault in ASOCT. I think that is also one thing which can be mentioned by the postgraduates
Yeah.
as a relative indication
Yes.
that can be mentioned.
Also like microspherophakia and all these things are an indication for a cataract surgery.
So
Also,
basically,
yeah,
I think Ankur has raised a very important point. I have myself done in microspherophakia, and patient is under control for the last 15 years or so without any drug.
So
also, I think
microspherophakia with some problems or just plain microspherophakia? With some associated angle closure glaucoma also?
Yes, of course. This patient which I am talking of had a bilateral angle closure attack, acute attack. And this patient, I removed the lens, and the patient is doing fine.
Also, I think they should understand that doing a cataract surgery in glaucoma patients, some of them actually backfire. Rather than having a controlled IOP, the patient goes from a good control preoperatively on drugs to a bad control post-cataract surgery because of inflammation and synechia formation. So cataract surgery can cut both ways actually. So that's why I think most of the glaucoma specialists would kind of not tread into cataract unless it is very much required.
And when you want to do cataract surgery, you should use topical steroids for a few days in a patient with chronic glaucoma.
And maybe for a longer time, sir. Like for glaucoma patients, I continue to use little longer as compared to.
I'm talking of any plain simple cataract surgery in a patient who has been on drugs for glaucoma. Pre-operatively, patient should be given topical steroids for a few days.
To reduce inflammation, sir.
Yes, to reduce the possibility of post-operative, because these patients are invariably on PG analogs. So even if you stop PG analog for a week or so, the totally inflammation doesn't go. So you have to keep the patient on pre-operative steroids. And secondly, about the ocular surface. Ocular surface gets damaged because of the long-term use of these drugs, and that gets stabilized by the use of steroids, topical steroids.
Very important. So related to this, I can ask you that if you are stopping prostaglandin and you have done a cataract surgery, you want to restart prostaglandin, how long you wait? Or
3 months. 3 months, unless it is absolutely must to start. In case it is absolutely must to start, you can start even on day 1. But ideally,
ideal time is 3 months.
Mostly we don't use it for 3 months.
So basically, we let the eye become quiet completely, then we start it so that patient doesn't have a rebound inflammation or some CME lot of thing. So one more thing you're talking about.
Manish, we do not actually, we underestimate the incidence of this CME post cataract surgery. It is much more than what we actually record and see, and nobody is doing FA post cataract surgery.
So if you start doing DFA and OCT, will get more CMEs than what we are actually seeing.
Definitely.
Also, the onset of CME is 4 to 6 months, 6 weeks after the cataract surgery. By that time, you have given the glasses and patient is packed off back home. You stop following the patients after 1 month of a cataract surgery.
That's a very important take-home message. Sir, one thing you're talking about the ocular surface. So after that, there is a lot of discussion that we should avoid benzyl alkonium drugs. What is your take on these?
Of course, if it is possible to avoid benzalkonium chloride, you should avoid it. But as I told you in my talk also, the effect is much more of the drug per se, and the role of preservative is very, very little. Very, very little. It is not so much as it is being highlighted by the ocular surface patient, the cornea specialist and all, the ocular surface specialist, because they are pressurized by the industry. It is the drugs. Our drugs are the mainstay of the problem, not the preservative. It is a problem. Yes, they are a problem, much less.
So, Dr. Ankur, anything you would like to just one word about injectable anti-glaucoma medicines also are coming. Anything you like to share with the PGs?
Yeah, we have a new prostaglandin anti-segment insert which has been recently FDA approved. I think we'll have to see. That will be a good, if it doesn't cause so much inflammation, let us see. It will be a good choice because the compliance actually gets a little better when we have these inserts. Like if you look back in the history, we had these contact lenses and the pilocarpine inserts being done from in the America, and then they were a good choice. So let us hope that we have these inserts. Maybe a
See,
subconjunctival insert would be a better option. I personally feel.
These
rather
are
than
the
segment.
entry chamber inserts. So
Yeah,
we
these are
have
the-
anterior chamber inserts, we have vitreous inserts, we have subconjunctival inserts. In addition to the fact that they require surgery, another big problem, the drug delivery from these is erratic. Sometimes the drug delivery is less, sometimes it is more. So it is not consistent. That is the cause. That is the reason why they have been, in research for decades now, but still they have not been commercially made available. This is the main reason. And of course, there is a surgical intervention which is required for most of these things. Nothing at the moment is, I think, accepted except the punctal plugs.
and the last question, sir. Drug of choice in a glaucoma patient with CME and glaucoma patient with ocular inflammation. So two separate questions. So basically, uveitic glaucoma or inflammatory glaucoma. What is your preferred drug?
See, it can be, in case Timolol is the drug. Timolol is the next choice
Unless
after PDN.
contraindicated with the
So
best option.
in case the patient has some systemic disease also. But I want to highlight here as well when I'm talking of beta blockers, ischemic heart disease is not a contraindication for beta blockers, because in ischemic heart disease, even systemic beta blockers are the drug of choice. So a lot of PG students are under the impression if IAG is there, we don't use this. No, they are the drug of choice. However, in case there is a cardiac failure or if there are bradyarrhythmias or if there are respiratory problems, then they are contraindicated. So the second, in case any of these systemic problems is there, or in case there is a severe ocular surface problem, then you go with the brimonidine or brinzolamide. Dorzolamide is a little less innocuous, but the problem with these drugs is that in case used singly, they are required 3 times a day, and of course they have their own side effects. But these are the next choice.
I think the first drug of choice, the established ones, as Timolol, as sir has already said. Yes, the conduction defects are a stronger contraindication, and IHD is not. But I would like to add that the newer drugs like Etazodil and Ripasudil can be a better drug of choice in macular edema and ocular inflammation, because they tend to reduce the flare in the antechamber, and also they have some amount of beneficial effect in the macular edema. In fact, these guys are even claiming that they can in fact help reduce macular edema using these drugs. I don't know how this is going to act, but I mean, at least it is not going to create more macular edema, at least with the PGs and all. So maybe the next drug would be Ripasudil.
Ripasudil has been available in Japan. I have not done much study on this, but in India it was available only a month before month before the lockdown started.
Maybe at present we'll go with Timolol only as a best drug.
Yes,
and
the best
avoid
drug would be.
prostaglandins.
Yeah.
And in CME patient also we'll avoid prostaglandin and we'll try Timolol. Maybe dorzolamide can also be considered in a patient with CME because there is some role of
that's the next choice.
And so there is another question for you, sir. You can explain again why tropicamide should be used and not the combination, that thing which you are highlighting, that we should not use a tropicamide phenylephrine and only tropicamide.
I would love to repeat it because this is extremely important in practical as well as in theory. There are 3 factors involved in this. Factor number 1, we do not have any antidote for phenylephrine in case the patient goes into acute attack. Secondly, it causes maximal pupillary dilatation, and the patient does not go into acute attack in maximal pupillary dilatation. We want to assess the patient in clinic at the maximum stress, and the maximum stress is when the maximum likelihood of going into acute attack, maximum stress is when the pupil is mid dilated, and that happens with a tropicamide alone, not in combination. And the third thing is that while for the patient to go into acute attack, a certain contact period at the mid dilated position is required. When we are using a combination, then the pupil dilates to its maximum within 20 to 30 minutes. As a result, there is not enough contact period while dilating that the patient will go into acute attack. So patient will not go into acute attack. Whereas when the pupil is constricting back to its physiological normal size, by that time it will be 3 or 4 or 5 hours would have passed. So now the pupil will come to a mid dilated position in 3, 4, 5 hours after having put the drops, by this time patient would have left the clinic and may have gone 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometers away. So in case the patient has to go to acute attack in mid-dilated position, patient will go 4 hours after the instillation of the initial drop. So in 4 hours, the patient will then have to will go into acute attack at home, and there will be no control. Treatment will be difficult. Patient will have to come back, or patient will have to suffer.
Thank you so much, sir. I think probably this is all the questions we had for the presentation. It was a lovely interaction. I think we all must have gained a lot of new points. So I'll hand over the session to Dr. Satyajit. And thank you, Manavdeep Singh sir. Thank you, Dr. Ankur,
Thank
for
you.
sparing this valuable time for the PGs.
Thank you.
Thank you
Dr.
so much.
Manish, and thank you, Dr. Satyajit.
Satyajit, sir.
Thank you. It was such a treat to have Dr. Ankur Sinha and Dr. Manavdeep Singh, Professor Singh today. It's a real boon and blessing for all the postgraduates who have attended this class. I especially love that slide of that in which Professor Manavdeep Singh sir showed, starting from PG analogs, whether you tolerate it and you don't tolerate it, and the IOP lowers, it doesn't lower. That flow chart is so nice, sir, and it will really help the postgraduates. I'm so grateful to sir and Dr. Ankur both for sharing their time and their valuable inputs to all the postgraduates. Thank you so much to all of you. I'm also grateful to tomorrow's speakers who are already here. I see Dr. Sagar Bhargav is here and Dr. Kumar Ravi is here in preparation for tomorrow. So that shows how well professionally they are taking this. And I'm thanking you in advance for being here today also. Thank you so much, Manav sir. Thank you so much, Dr. Ankur, for giving your time. And a lot of the postgraduates are seeing these videos around the world. So it's not only who are here right now, but they are going on the YouTube, on the channel, and people are seeing it again and again. And postgraduates are using it for revision. So a lot of postgraduates in India and around the world are going to be blessed by your presentation today. Thank you so much, sir.
Sir,
Thank you so
may I say a word? May I say a word, sir?
Yes, please, sir.
Manish had mentioned about my video on applanation tonometry.
Yes.
That had got around 132,000 videos views till now, and that is the maximally seen video on this topic. And but it was very old video, so I have uploaded a new high definition video of the same, little more 3-4 minutes extra, and that has been, all those who have seen the video earlier are requested to see the new one also, which is much better and is much more professionally made.
We'll do it, sir. And we'll also share that link with our PGs so that they also can have a look.
Yes.
Because that applanation video, I remember I had seen, and hello, and it was a lovely video.
These guys are waiting for me.
It's okay. The webinar is over now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Dr.
Okay. Thank you much. Thank you so much, everybody.
And
Thank you, Dr.
sir.